Welcome to Strong, Confident, and Informed, the podcast where we go beyond surface level fitness advice and actually help you understand what's driving your results. I'm Danielle Lemoyne, an online fitness coach who helps women build strength, lose fat, and most importantly, stay consistent without constantly starting over. Today's episode is going to be a bit deeper, a little more honest, and probably a little uncomfortable at times. But I think this conversation matters because I see so many women stuck in the same cycle. They want to change deeply, but they struggle to actually sustain the behaviors required to create it. And I think a lot of people assume that if they want something badly enough, they should automatically be able to follow through consistently. So when they don't, they start labeling themselves as lazy or unmotivated, that they're broken or weak and incapable. When honestly, that's usually not the full story. Because wanting change and being ready for change are not the same thing. And understanding the difference between those two things can completely change how you approach your habits, your fitness journey, and even yourself. Most people generally do want change. They want to feel more confident. They want better health. They want that fat loss. They want to see themselves be consistent and have better energy, have increased strength, and even the freedom from constantly starting over. That desire is real. But our desire alone does not create the change. Because long-term change requires more than motivation. It requires emotional capacity, behavioral change, identity shifts. It requires your nervous system safety. It requires consistency and the willingness to tolerate discomfort long enough for change to happen. And that's the part that people don't always realize. Because wanting change often still lives in that fantasy. It lives in imagining the future version of ourselves. Consuming content, buying programs, getting inspired, planning your fresh start, waiting for that motivation, even telling yourself that it's going to be different this time. And honestly, that phase can feel productive, but it's still very mental, very emotional, and very future focused. Readiness, though, readiness is different. Readiness moves into behavior. So what does readiness look like? It looks like following through imperfectly, staying engaged during your hard weeks, being emotionally honest, accepting that discomfort, simplifying things instead of constantly restarting, taking ownership, letting go of your perfectionism, and becoming willing to look at the patterns underneath your habits. And those are completely different things. Honestly, this is why so many people feel trapped in cycles. Because they keep trying to change their outcomes without changing the deeper systems driving their behaviors. And this is where we need to talk about psychology a little bit. Because your behaviors are not random. Your patterns are not random. The things you avoid, the things you sabotage, the moments you start to disappear, the times you stop following through, there's usually something underneath that. And most people try to solve those deeper issues with surface level strategies. With a more discipline, a harder plan, putting more pressure on themselves or a stricter routine. But if the underlying pattern never changes, the cycle's just going to repeat itself. Because your brain will always pull you back toward what feels familiar and emotionally safe, even when that familiar pattern is frustrating or not serving you anymore. This is why people can desperately want change and still unconsciously resist it at the same time. Because change creates uncertainty, and uncertainty feels uncomfortable to the brain. This is also why people often self-sabotage right when they start making progress. And I think this confuses people a lot. They think, why would I sabotage something I want? But your nervous system does not prioritize your goals. It prioritizes familiarity and safety. So if you've spent years quitting on yourself, struggling with your consistency, emotionally coping through food, living in those all or nothing cycles, or feeling ashamed about your body and constantly restarting, those patterns become emotionally familiar, even if they hurt you. And when you start trying to become someone different, your brain often interprets that as uncomfortable, it's unsafe, it's uncertain. So what happens? You avoid it. You procrastinate. You negotiate with yourself and you start to disconnect. You start saying, I'll start tomorrow, or you stop checking in. You start to drift away. Not because you don't care, but because your internal patterns are stronger than your current behaviors. And this is why long-term change requires identity work too. Because eventually, your behaviors have to become connected to a new identity. You have to stop only asking, what do I need to do? And start asking, who do I become? Who do you need to become? Because if you still deeply identify as somebody who always quits, who struggles, who fails, who can't stay consistent, and who self-sabotages, then even when you start taking action, your brain will constantly look for evidence to reinforce that old identity. And this is why people often feel emotionally exhausted by the process of change. Because internally, there's conflict happening. Parts of them want to grow. Another part of them is terrified of that growth. They're terrified of that failure, the discomfort, the vulnerability that it takes. They're afraid of that inconsistency, the judgment, the responsibility, and even losing familiar coping patterns. And honestly, I think this is one of the most understood parts of health and fitness, because people think transformation is mostly physical, but real transformation is psychological first. The workouts matter, the nutrition matters, and all the structure matters, of course. But if your mindset, identity, and emotional patterns never evolve, you're going to keep creating the same outcomes. And this is also why I think so many people stay trapped in that starting over cycle. Because restarting temporarily relieves the discomfort. Think about it. When you restart, you feel hopeful again. You have that motivation again. You feel inspired. You're emotionally relieved again. You get to mentally wipe that slate clean. But eventually, the discomfort returns. And if you haven't built emotional resilience, you repeat the cycle again. So the goal can't just be, how do I stay motivated? The goal has to become, how do I build the capacity to stay engaged even when motivation drops? That's a completely different question. And honestly, that's where the real change begins. Not when you finally become perfectly disciplined, because that doesn't happen, but when you stop expecting the process to feel easy all the time. Because one of the biggest shifts someone can make is realizing that discomfort is not a sign that something's wrong. It's often a sign that something is changing. And I think this is where people accidentally sabotage themselves. They interpret resistance, discomfort, emotional triggers, and inconsistency as proof they're failing, instead of understanding that those moments are often part of the rewiring process. Because your old identity is going to try and pull you back. Your old habits will try and pull you back. Your old emotional coping patterns are going to try and pull you back. That's normal. And this is where that self-awareness becomes incredibly important. Because awareness creates choice. If you can notice that you're avoiding things, you're negotiating with yourself, you're emotionally checking out, and you're slipping into some of that all or nothing thinking, you now have the opportunity to interrupt the pattern instead of unconsciously repeating it. And honestly, that's one of the biggest things coaching can help with. Not just accountability, but awareness, pattern recognition, perspective. Because sometimes people don't need more information. They need help seeing themselves clearly. Now, I also want to say something important here. Being ready for change does not mean being perfectly motivated or perfectly healed and perfectly disciplined and that you're never struggling, okay? That's not realistic. Readiness is much quieter than people expect. Readiness often looks like willingness, honesty, staying engaged, openness, taking ownership, and continuing to come back instead of fully disconnecting. That's readiness. And honestly, one of the biggest signs someone is becoming ready for long-term change is when they stop trying to escape discomfort constantly. Because long-term change requires emotional tolerance. The ability to stay consistent without instant results, keep showing up during those stressful weeks, tolerate the imperfection, regulate your emotions without quitting, and continue building trust with yourself over time. That trust piece matters so much because every time you follow through, stay engaged, keep going imperfectly, stop restarting, and you make a better decision instead of a perfect one, you start slowly building evidence for a new identity. You stop reinforcing that I'll always quit. And you start reinforcing the I can stay in this, or I can recover from hard weeks, that you can keep going and that you can become someone different. And that's how real transformation happens. Not through intensity, not through shame, and not through pressure. Through that repetition, that awareness, your identity shifts and emotional resilience over time. And honestly, I think this is why coaching cannot save someone. A coach can create the structure, help simplify things, guide you, support you, help you see those patterns, and help you regulate your expectations. But a coach cannot create readiness for someone. That part has to come from within you. Because support only works when someone is willing to stay engaged with the process long enough for a change to happen. And that's why the deepest transformations usually happen when support and readiness is meeting each other. So if you've been feeling stuck lately, I want you to stop asking what's the perfect plan and ask, what patterns am I still protecting? What discomfort am I still avoiding? What identity am I operating from? And what would it look like to stay engaged instead of constantly starting over? Because maybe the answer isn't more pressure. Maybe the answer is deeper honesty. And honestly, that's where lasting change begins. If this episode resonated with you, I'd genuinely love to hear from you. Come message me on Instagram at DL Fitness Coaching and let me know what stood out to you. And if you're looking for coaching that goes deeper than just workouts and macros, that's exactly the work I do inside my coaching. You can find more details in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.